Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. So I'm Natalie Thill, and I direct the Adirondack Center for Writing. And if you're not familiar with the Adirondack Center for Writing, you should be. That's all there is to it. We're a literary organization, and we do writing programs for writers and readers throughout the whole Adirondack region. We're supported by the New York State Council for the Arts, and we're also a membership organization. And we do programs, all different kinds of writing programs. In fact, just yesterday, I was in Glens Falls for the entire day. We did a fiction writing boot camp. It was a 6-hour workshop focusing on the elements of fiction writing. And we have a publishing conference coming up in September 24th in North Creek, where I bring up agents and editors from Manhattan to do one-on-one manuscript critiques and talk about the publishing process. We do a variety of programs. So if you're not familiar with our organization, I encourage you to become familiar. Either talk to me after the program or go online at adirondackcenterforwriting.org. Everyone calls us the Adirondack Writers Center. It's a problem, but it's Adirondack Center for Writing. And we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. You have no excuse not to know everything about this organization. I thank Rich and Fort Ticonderoga for partnering with us today. This is part of a Native American Writers Series that we're presenting through funding from the Champlain Valley National Heritage Partnership through Lake Champlain Basin Program, Quadricentennial Legacy Grant. And what this is we are presenting Native American writers from the Lake Champlain area in a variety of venues throughout the Lake Champlain area. And part of that part is the legacy, and that is why Joel Hurd is here from North Country Public Radio. He's videotaping each of these presentations, and they're going to be made available on our website and on the website of each of our partners, so that it's not only a record, a permanent record of this talk today, but it's also sort of a snapshot of what people are thinking and asking questions about in the summer of 2011. So all of the questions that are taking place, the concerns and ideas that people have will all be recorded and kept for posterity. And the idea would be maybe 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, we'll revisit these recordings and see how perceptions have changed or evolved or devolved, hopefully not. So anyway, today's program is the second in the series. Next week, on August 13th, we're featuring Joe and Jesse Bruchak, who are father and son. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. They're going to be at the Paul Smith Vic, which is the new home of the Adirondack Center for Writing. Our office is there. And that's in the afternoon, 2 o'clock. And then we're featuring Robin Kimmerer on August 27th at Acw in Burlington. And she's an ecologist and studies traditional learning. And so what she'll do is give a talk about how that traditional ecological knowledge has influenced stewardship and restoration of the environment, which is a really fascinating talk, and I think it's a perfect venue at Acw there too. So that's August 27th. So I'm going to give a brief introduction. I actually had my own introduction of Doug, but he wrote cheat sheet, so I figured I'm just going to go ahead and go with his. So Doug was born and raised in the Akwesasne Mohawk Territory. He's the former editor of Akwesasne Notes and former member of the Board of Trustees of the National Museum of the American Indian. He's the co-founder of the Native American Journalists Association, and he's written several books, including Iroquois on Fire, Iroquois Culture, Sky Woman, and Beyond Forgiveness. He's the technical advisors for the First Nations Film Discovery Channel and the Battle of Oriskany History Channel. I'm really, really pleased to have Doug here, and over our emails, I've learned 4 Mohawk words. Is it 4? So I'm really, really pleased about that, and I intend to learn 4 more by the end of this program. So I welcome you, and thank you very much for joining us.
Gwegwe, Sego, welcome. Is there people here who have Iroquois heritage, ancestry? Oh, that's good. That is really good. So welcome back to a site that has great historical significance to our people. This, of course, is Mohawk territory. All that area that's west of Lake Champlain and north of the Mohawk River, south of the St. Lawrence, going as far west as the West Canada Creek, that's Mohawk territory. And I remember when I first was told that. I was in Longhouse, and one of the oral traditions of our people is that we were given custodialship over a certain part of Turtle Island. The oral traditions say that we as a people, a distinct people, can trace our ancestry back to the southwestern part of Analawagoa, the Great Turtle, and that we came to this region after a great migration that crossed the Great Plains, and for a while, according to the stories, that we settled in an area around what is now St. Louis, Missouri. We continued on our journey up the Ohio, and during the course of that part of our great epic, there were divisions that occurred within that people. A faction of that people went to the south and to the east, and in time became known as the Tulage, the Cherokee people. Another people went north. They became the Wyandots and the Hurons. Others settled around the area in Niagara Falls, the Wenros and the Neutrals. To the east of us went another people. They became known as the Conestoga or the Susquehanna and settled in what is now Pennsylvania. The main group, however, continued on this great journey through the Niagara Falls region, across Lake Ontario, and then down the St. Lawrence River until they arrived at a place between what is now Quebec and Montreal. And there they settled and were overwhelmed by another people, the Algonquins, who we call the Adirondacks, the porcupine people, because they flavored their food with the spices from certain trees, and that's literally what that name means, they bark eaters. After a time, there was a conflict between these two people. We retraced our steps because we remembered there was an area that looked as though it could hold a growing community. And we arrived in what is now the central New York region, where the Oswego River empties into Lake Ontario. And from there, we spread to different directions. Furthest east, of course, were the Mohawks, and then our younger brothers are the Oneidas. A member of our group, a faction, went farther south. They became the Tuscaroras. And then the Central Firekeepers were the Onondagas, the people who dwelled in that great area of natural medicines, the Cayugas. And then further west along the Genesee River were the Senecas. And in time, each developed their own language, each developed their own national identity. What is interesting about this story is it's an oral tradition that was preserved by people like the Seneca ethno-historian and former director in New York State Museum, Arthur C. Parker, and then of course our own great teacher, Ray Fadden. In a time when most Iroquois stories and legends were being put aside as we became more formally educated, these individuals went about and listened to the stories of their elders and carried those forward. And it was a very tenuous kind of tradition, because without them doing that, these things would have been lost, and that powerful epic that determines who we are as human beings would have been obscured. But they prevailed. They kept the story alive. And so it's now become part of our heritage, something that we teach our children. And so the Mohawks were given this area that stretches from the St. Lawrence, where the Richelieu River meets the St. Lawrence, as far south as the west branch of the Delaware River. And I remember hearing inside the Longhouse in those days when we were becoming very politically active in the 1960s and 70s, that Mohawks had submitted various claims to the state, and that the state wanted a definition as to how much of that area we were actually laying claim to. And they were always mentioning this figure of 9 million acres. 9 million acres. That's what we owned as Mohawk people. And so I began to wonder about that. And so using contemporary maps and surveys, I took the area that, according to our oral tradition, was that area that was within our traditional boundaries, Schoharie County, Essex County, Clinton County, Herkimer County, Franklin County, added those all up and came up with the figure of just over 9 million acres. So there's some validity to what this story tells, and there's some validity to the oral traditions, because now you have the linguists and those historians and those anthropologists who actually give our teachings credence and examine them for historical and physical fact, and can sustain this, that in fact the Iroquois are a people who came from the south and west, that there are linguistic connections to other native people, and that we trace our ancestry to the same root as the people who now currently live in the Rio Grande, the Hopi and Tewa peoples. And in fact that language has a common ancestry. And in fact they found that Cherokee is an Iroquois language, and that they can point to the time of separation, and I believe it was about 3,800 years ago. So that gives us meaning. And it's not to say that we have to find verification from these physical sciences. It just assures us that what our elders told about who we were, what we were, and where we came from is a truth, because they don't lie. They don't mislead us. It reminds me a few years ago, there's a great native writer, probably the most profound political writer of the last 100 years, a Lakota named Vine Deloria. He's a good friend of mine. He and I worked as trustees on the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington and various other projects. One of the things we worked on is gathering Native people together, storytellers, oral historians from throughout North America, and we would address a specific topic. We had a series of conferences to discuss animals and plants and star knowledge and origins. And it was the Origins Conference that was held at the University of Colorado in Boulder that really drew a lot of attention. And that was very important, because one of the great challenges to Aboriginal people, and to Mohawk people, and to Iroquois people, is that we are a people who are migratory, that we came from Siberia, or the newest theory that we somehow came from Greenland and then hopscotched through Iceland and the Falkland Islands, not the Falklands, the Faroe Islands in Northern Europe. But it was always that sense that we were transitory, that we were not of this land, that we did not derive our identity from North America or South America. So we drew together those people who still hold on to that ancient knowledge, and we came up with certain conclusions, because everybody shared what they knew, shared what had been entrusted to them. And remember, these are people who are not accustomed to bringing this information forward, because it's subject to a lot of challenges and attack by people who have a vested interest in a specific academic field. For instance, those people who are wedded to this fantasy called Clovis, and that somehow Native people did not arrive here till 12,000 years ago. And despite the linguistic evidence that the great diversity of Aboriginal indigenous languages throughout the Americas points to a time of occupation that goes far, far back, far, far beyond 12,000 years. So we decided to challenge that. And Vine Deloria took particular delight in tweaking the ears of these professionals. And so once we put all our stories into a big pot, and then we took out what was there. And we asked everyone, the Inuits who had been there, the Anishinaabe from the Great Lakes, the Pueblo peoples, the Iroquois, the Lakotas, even the Mayans, where did you come from? It's fundamental to human identity. We need to know that we are of substance. We need to know that we have a story. And the disruption of that story in any given people, whether it's the people who inhabit the village of Ticonderoga, or the people of this nation, the United States of America, if you don't have a valid story, if you don't have a valid narrative, then you endure a kind of disruption. You become a lost and wandering people. You have to have that part of you, that sense of community and belonging to something that's far beyond you as an individual. A great epic. We can certainly see the power of that in peoples around the world, like the Israelis, the descendants of the Israelis, the Israelites, the Jewish people, and what kept them together over hundreds of years of vigorous persecution was this sense of common identity, that heritage that bound them to a specific land and a specific place. Well, we had that same story. So, where did we come from? Everybody pointed to a common area, and that was the American Southwest. And then when we asked the people in the American Southwest, they pointed further south. And they said the place of origin for all Aboriginal peoples in the Americas was the highlands of Nicaragua and Guatemala. Fortunately, we had Mayan people there. And we asked the Mayan people, well, where did you come from? If we came from where you are, where did you come from? And the Mayans said, well, their story tells them that they came from a great land, a land of bounty where people were technologically advanced, whether they were able to master the power of the sun. And like human beings, they experimented with that. And in the experimentation, they caused a great disruption. They used it for warfare rather than for good. And using the gift of intellect and awareness that the Creator had given to us, they created this great weapon of destruction. It caused a great imbalance on the earth, which is where the Ice Age came from. And then that land was inundated by water, which is consistent with the stories of most peoples of the world, and certainly is a common thread through virtually every Native American tradition about origins, about coming from a body of water. And their story is that these people, because of their misbehavior, the earth shifted, the polarity shifted, and the refugees from that land sailed east and found refuge on the tops of certain hills that they could see far in the distance, and those hills where Central America is. And that's the place where people began to spread out to both Americas. That's the story. And so what I tell people, especially younger ones who are interested in the area of archaeology or history, is to listen to that story very carefully. And if you want to make the great find of the 21st century, then abide by these stories and shift your attention from the Bering Strait to this land that lays under the Pacific, about 4 days sailing west of what is now Central America. And this whole thing about Bering Strait is just that. It's just a theory. It cannot happen. It never happened. When you think about it, it's totally impractical and downright silly. But nonetheless, it's something that for the most part, Western scientists are absolutely wedded to. It has now become entrenched. And challenging that, of course, is not only our duty, but it can be also a lot of fun. Because the hard physical evidence actually bears us out. But that's one of the powers of oral tradition. And in Mohawk territory, when it comes to our homeland, we have always known what our boundaries were. In the 1500s, when Jacques Cartier first arrived in Iroquois territory, he was greeted by people at what is now Quebec City and in Montreal. And in fact, he encountered a group of Iroquois people who were harvesting or hunting whales on the Gaspé Peninsula. That's an intriguing fact because it's indicative of certain things that were taking place in Native America prior to colonization. Now, one of the things you have to remember is that colonization by the Europeans in North America did not happen when the Pilgrims stepped on Plymouth Rock in 1620 or 1621, or it didn't happen at Jamestown in 1608, or it didn't happen with Samuel Champlain in Annapolis and then at Quebec City. The Europeans had been vigorously trying to settle the Americas ever since our first encounter with an individual called Cristobal Colon in 1492. And there's another myth that we learned about when Jake Swamp, the late Jake Swamp, really one of our great leaders, and I were at a World Conference, a World Parliament of Religions in Barcelona, Spain, 5 years ago. And as Jake and I were traveling about, we found ourselves in a small square in Barcelona, in the Old Town, not too far from the Picasso Museum. And as we were looking at these steps that were leading to what looked like a palace, an American tourist, an expatriate, showed up and told us a story that on those steps is where this individual named Colon showed up after he had come back from the Americas with a group of native peoples who were bound in chains. And on those steps is where he presented those native people as a gift to Queen Isabella. And what we learned more was that Colon was not Italian. He was not from Genoa. He was Barcelonan. He spoke Catalonian. His family name was Colom, C-O-L-O-M, and he was a wayward teenager, joined a group of pirates and got trapped outside of Portugal, but he changed his name for various reasons, casually, but enough that he could be accepted back in society. He spoke Catalonian. He was not Italian. That's what they told us, the people from that area. But it was important to know that because, you know, the power of myth and legend in American society often obscures the truth. And it certainly has with our Mohawk people. When Europeans first came here, this was an area that was heavily cultivated. It was a place that was ecologically designed to produce certain types of products by the indigenous inhabitants. They were not primitive, they were not wanderers. As shown in Charles Mann's book, 1491, that Aboriginal people in the Americas were very careful custodians of the land, that they planted certain crops in order to maximize certain protein yields. For instance, the most common tree in this area prior to the lumberjacks coming through was the chestnut tree. And the chestnut tree was planted by the millions by the Mohawks for certain specific reasons. One, they wanted to harvest the fruit that came from the chestnuts, but they also wanted to make sure that the food was available in order to enhance the growth and strength of certain species of animals. If the primary source of mammal protein for the Mohawk people was deer, then you wanted to make sure that you had a constant supply of that deer, and that deer had the maximum amount of physical well-being. That's what the Mohawks did. When Samuel Champlain decided that he was going to ally himself with the Adirondack people and come down just on the shores here, just beneath this bluff, and encounter the Mohawk people, who did he see? Well, he saw Mohawk people that were prepared to defend their communities, but more importantly, what he saw in front, and it's depicted in one of the sketches that he made, was that they were Mohawk leaders, that they had what we call like a stoas, the feathered headdress, and that they had walked in front of the Mohawk military unit in order to try to reach some kind of accommodation to these invaders. But it's indicative of other things, and that is that this area was widely cultivated and widely settled by the Mohawk people. While in historic times most of our population was concentrated west of what is now in Albany in the Mohawk Valley, by no means was this place ever left uninhabited up until that time. When Champlain was taken by those Algonquins and through the lakes, he noticed that there was extensive cultivation, cornfields on both sides of Lake Champlain. And he asked his guides, well, who is that? Who lives here? Well, they told him, the Mohawks. We had villages scattered throughout this area. We had villages at Lake George, and when Champlain landed on the shores not too far from here, that's who he encountered. But it was people who came forward in an attempt to reach some kind of peace with this man. Now, far different than what the myths tell us, the Mohawks were well aware of who the Europeans were. Remember, we had encountered Jacques Cartier a couple generations before Champlain arrived. What Jacques Cartier found along the St. Lawrence Valley was that area contained thousands of native people. And it was, again, an area that he described, as others have after him, as park-like in its contours and its vegetation. And again, that was deliberate. The Mohawks realized that you needed to have certain wood products available in order to heat your longhouses. And it made sense to plant certain trees that would maximize the greatest amount of heat with the least amount of physical labor. So trees were planted, trees like elm and maples, hardwoods, in order to do just that. When the Europeans came here, one of the first things they saw was these great expanses of forest, white pines, 150, 170, 200 feet tall. And we saw yesterday the remnants of some of those trees just a little bit away from here in Warrensburg. And when you walk through that grove that's just west of Warrensburg, you get a slight idea of the magnificence of the forest of the Northeast. And when the Europeans saw that, it's one of the first things they did, Samuel Champlain and others, was get his crew together and start cutting down those trees. And there's a direct relation between the expansion of European technologies and ocean-going vessels and the harvesting of trees that came from this area. Because Europeans, if you look at their vessels at that time, if you look at the Mayflower and Henry Hudson's Half Moon, you'll see that they were rather small vehicles with shortened masts. After they began to harvest the trees in this area, you have a rapid expansion in the fleet of the British Navy and the Dutch and the French. Not by accident, but by design. They harvested our trees, brought them back to Europe, and that led directly to the securing of the Dutch and the French, and especially the English, of dominance on the high seas. It would have been impossible without access to our forests. So this area was well known to us. In Mohawk, the town here is called Ticonderoga, and it means where the two rivers meet. So it was a strategic place for us. One of the things that we did as Mohawk people is we always established a certain physical viability at key geographical areas within our Aboriginal territories. For instance, my home of Acw, it had been inhabited by native people for thousands of years. With the great dispersal that happened after Jacques Cartier and the introduction of communicable diseases that wiped out anywhere from 70 to 90% of native people in the Northeast, our population was compelled to retreat. So while Acw had once been a place that had extensive human habitation, by the first decades of the 1700s had been abandoned. We reestablished our community in the 1740s for specific geopolitical reason, in that it happens to be located at a very important junction of four rivers that flow from the Adirondacks into the St. Lawrence. The Raquette, the Grass, the St. Regis, and the Salmon all give us direct access into the Adirondack interior. The Adirondack interior was well known to us. It was a common hunting ground. Now, the descriptions of the Europeans who had come into this area would describe the Adirondacks as some type of hunter's paradise. In that area, you had a wide diversity of animal species. You had caribou, you had elk, you had grizzly, you had panther. And south of us, along the Mohawk Valley corridor, you had a species of large animals with a woolly hide, the woodland buffalo. Years ago, when I went into when it started to go to Longhouse, they had a dance they called the Buffalo Dance, and I was always curious about that. What do they mean, the Buffalo Dance? How come we have that? Maybe it's something that we borrowed from the Lakotas, because the Iroquois used to work as members of the Wild West Show and Buffalo Bill. But later on, I learned differently, that in fact the buffalo is an indigenous species to New York State. And they made their way as far east as what is now western Massachusetts. And so the Mohawks were able also to harvest the buffalo. Each one of these species demands a certain amount of resources. And the Iroquois, realizing that we were heavily dependent upon them, made sure that they had adequate access to those resources and that we didn't overhunt. And so the Adirondacks became a great hunting preserve for all Native people. And this is one of the dictates and the rules of the Iroquois Confederacy. And I'll explain how I learned about it. Well, I knew about it before, but how in one meeting with the state, it really became clear to me. I was part of the Mohawk Nation Land Claims Committee. And it was my job as part of that committee in order to research the validity of our claim to this region. And I'll tell you this, that there's no existing document that you can point to where the Mohawks have ever surrendered sovereignty over this territory. It is our land according not only to our definitions, but yours as well. It was never conceded consistent with the Royal Proclamation of 1763. It was never conceded according to any existing American law. The U.S. has two papers that they point to in their defense that we had given up this area. One was the 1796 Treaty with the Seven Nations of Canada, and the second was 1797 Joseph Brant Treaty. Those aren't valid under Mohawk law. But, so the basis of our claim when we come to the state, and when I was a part of the negotiating team, is that we can argue and debate over land use, but it is not our prerogative to surrender to the state any part of it, Aboriginal territory. It is still ours. And that's important for us as Mohawk people psychologically and legally, that we still have a valid claim to this area upon which this fort sits. It's never been given up. So we're in a meeting with the state, and it's a very heated discussion. At one point, the state is pointing out all of its rules regarding the environment, all of its rules in regard to hunting and fishing, and they want to challenge us. They say to us, well, we have this extensive statutes that protect the integrity of the land and the resources. And so they said, well, what's your response to that after all of this, and after pointing to all of this extensive rules? And one of our chiefs, Irv Paulus of Onondaga, stood up and said, you know, we as Iroquois, we only have 4 rules when it comes to land, when it comes to the environment, and when it comes to animals and hunting of animals. 4 rules. And the state was immediately alert. You know, you can almost see their ears go like this, and they begin to take attention. You know, because they're thinking, how can you reduce all of this to 4 rules? Oh yeah, we have 4 rules. Those rules are, first, never take more than what you could use. And the second rule was always give thanks for that with what you've taken. The third rule, always leave things better than what you found them. And the fourth rule is take only what you need and nothing more. Well, I thought that was, you know, the best summation of our philosophy that I'd heard in a long time. But it's indicative of our culture, of how we manage to sustain the life over a period of many generations. Only take what you need. Use everything that you take. Give thanks for what you have, and leave things better than what you found them. Those are the 4 rules by which we live. Well, it's that kind of oral tradition, that kind of philosophy, that kind of ideology that guides us even to the present day. So when it comes to our presence here in Fort Ticonderoga region, let me get you into some specifics. We always knew this area. When the various military expeditions came up and down this corridor, the Mohawks were always retained as scouts or retained as frontline fighters. In the 1750s, when the French began this, and English began this world war called the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, they made sure that they enlisted Mohawk support. The French had scouts coming from our Mohawk community of Gunawaga near Montreal and Akwesasne, and then the English had the Mohawk people commanded under Sir William Johnson from the Mohawk Valley. And just outside this fort, a little ways from here, south of here, there was a battle fought. And one of our great leaders, Tayanahoga, Hendrick, was killed, and killed by other Mohawks. Such was the manipulations of the time. We initially didn't want to fight, but some people got carried away, and as a result of that, we lost one of our great leaders. During the 7 Years' War, again, our Iroquois people, our Mohawk people were deeply involved in that. When the French made their defense just outside this fort, there were Mohawk allies there. Mohawk scouts given the instruction to bring in prisoners to gather intelligence in the movement of the English. One of the things we noticed is that they engaged in this series of warfare that to us that was absolutely ridiculous. Stand, march in formation, and then at a certain command, fire at each other across an open field. That's not the Mohawk way of fighting. And we tried hard to teach them otherwise. One of the individuals that learned how to fight like a native person and win by arbitration rather than by pitched battle was a colonel of the Virginia militia named George Washington. And he was accused as such by the British. During the American Revolution, important events happened here. You had an individual called Ethan Allen who showed up here and took some of the cannons from this place and used them against the British troops in Boston. Now the key point about that war, it was a civil war amongst the Iroquois, that we had different elements fighting against each other. It was never a war where we issued a formal declaration against the Americans or the British, but we were certainly caught up in it. And for the Mohawks, and this is very, very important, it was a war in defense of our homelands. You see, to us, the primary cause of that conflict was land and who would control land, and that the colonists were very angry when the British issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, followed by the 1768 Fort Stanwix Treaty, which prohibited settlement west of the Appalachians. Much of that area, and also central Pennsylvania, was controlled by the Iroquois Confederacy or our allies. To us, the primary cause of that conflict was a fight over land. It had always been a fight over land. From the first time the Pilgrims landed in what is now Cape Cod to the current day, it has always been a struggle over land and who controls the resources of that territory. And it was that way. That's how we saw it. We made peace agreements with the colonists in 1775 and 1776, even before formal Declaration of Independence was declared. The first treaties entered into with the United Colonies was with the Iroquois Confederacy for the specific reason that they knew that if we had thrown our collective might with the British, that there was no hope whatsoever that the revolution would succeed. That if you took the total amount of fighting forces available to the Iroquois Confederacy at that time, it outnumbered the amount of men that George Washington had under his direct command at any given time during that war. But we had our own political divisions, and that's what crippled us. And finally, that's what destroyed any attempt by our leaders to hold on to our land after the war, because the people of this state were in a spirit of absolute defiance, that they came close to actually separating from the rest of the nations based upon their assertion that they could take over Iroquois territory without interference from the federal government. And there was a series of wars that took place in the 1790s that have been totally obscured by American history. Why? Because you basically lost. The two greatest battles ever, at which the Americans have ever lost in your history, occurred not any place in Europe or Asia or Vietnam. It took place in Ohio in 1790 and 1791 under the command of Blue Jacket, and then later a remarkable leader who took up Blue Jack's challenge, Tecumseh. But Blue Jacket defeated the Americans in pitched battle. Not unusual for an Indian force. We defeated the Americans at the Battle of Wyoming in Pennsylvania, not the massacre. It was a pitched battle in which the Iroquois employed very sophisticated field techniques and maneuvers worthy of any fighting force. It wasn't simply screaming in the woods and then hitting somebody with a tomahawk. This was very sophisticated military techniques. In the War of 1812, again, our Iroquois people, using our fighting skills, defeated American intrusions into what is now Upper and Lower Canada, at Chateauguay, at Chrysler's Farm, at Lundy's Lane, at Queenston Heights, at Beaver's Dam. It was our people, our fighting people, that made the difference. And that's a critical part of history that's been, again, lost in the fabrication of this myth that somehow we were primitive and somehow lacked the intellect to sustain this kind of activity on the field for a prolonged period of time. The hard historical fact is different than that, and it needs to be studied and understood. And so what we have accepted, some of us amongst the Iroquois Confederacy, are presentations like this, to challenge your perception of who we are as a people now, and don't be misled by the current silliness that's distracting us, but to understand who we are based upon direct communication with our people, and also the obligation to challenge those things that have become cherished myths in American history. There are some writers who have done this. I mentioned Charles Mann. I urge you to read the books of Jack Weatherford, who was a professor out of Macalester College in Minnesota. And he took on a responsibility that was given to academics by our great teacher, Ray Fadden, who was one of the most profound intellects ever to live in the Adirondacks, and still his son and his grandsons keep his museum at Anjayota, not too far from here. But you should go there. It should be a pilgrimage, eye-opening pilgrimage. And it was Ray who first challenged in a formal way this misconception about Native people. And he's the one who came up with the idea that Indian contributions, the Iroquois contributions, have changed the human dynamic. That what we eat and what we wear and how we think is far more closer to the indigenous people of this land than it is to Europe. Your perceptions of liberty and individual rights didn't come from Europe. It could not have come from Europe. Impossible. There's not one instance in European history that I could see of where you had democratic traditions. And forget the Greeks, where half the population was enslaved. Forget the Romans, where society was sustained by the active suppression of women and again, indentured peoples. True freedom existed here. And there's a reason why those Tea Party people who don't understand their own history should look back and say, why did Tea Party start? It started with a group of people who were trying to act like natives, and specifically Mohawks. Why Mohawks? Because they were the true exemplar of liberty on this continent. The people that the colonists held in the highest regard as any native, before any native people. And then when they dumped that tea into the party, into the harbor at Boston in 1773, they were acting as freedom-loving Americans. And who were the Americans? Up until the Revolution, the Americans were native people. They were the Bostonians. They did not think of themselves as Americans. That didn't come only after years of struggle against Britain. Now that's the absolute truth. And look into your history, and I need to remind those Tea Party people of what actually means. And it doesn't just mean individual liberty. It means an acknowledgement that we exist in partnership with this land, this earth, that we have certain responsibilities towards the next coming generations whose faces are yet in the ground. And this is, again, not just an idle philosophy, but has to be a guiding principle. And the way to understand that is by looking back into our collective history, and understanding this experience from an Aboriginal perspective. Now, what we have here is we have a couple of minutes for questions, but I want to give you some pretty good news. We decided that as Iroquois, we can't just be passive when it comes to our human experience on Turtle Island. We have a duty towards every occupant of what is our Aboriginal territory. So what we did is we created the Aiwatha Institute. It's called aiwatha.syr.edu in partnership with Syracuse University, in order to move as a people to preserve, protect, and promote traditional knowledge. And you'd be surprised by how much the Iroquois have retained when it comes to traditional knowledge that can really make a difference in this country. Now, you are a nation, unfortunately, that seems to be stumbling about without a rudder. And you need to get back on track and find out, well, why do you have the great gift of life? Why did the Creator enable you to form this great nation based upon these high human principles of freedom? But it also comes with responsibility. So we've created the Hiawatha Institute in order to draw together those people who still have this knowledge and make it available to anybody in the world who wants to learn what it's like to live as a native people in a state of ecological balance. That's your challenge before you. So we've done that. And in the coming months and years, you're going to hear a lot about us. We're working in partnership with Syracuse University. We are securing a land, 1,200 feet of land on the north shore of Mohawk River at Cohoes Falls, because Cohoes Falls figures prominently in our traditions, a very sacred place. We're moving towards secure land in not too far from Saranac Lake in order to open a traditional knowledge center there. But it'll be a degree program. So if you want to learn Mohawk and get a degree, you can do it. If you want to learn about Native history, now for the first time, you'll be able to do it and do it online. So that's the good news that we're bringing for you, that we're continuing on with these teachings and sharing them with, again, whomever has a desire to learn. And look for us to be a very viable, active presence in the Adirondack region. And I hope that in the next little while, as we get more of a sense of what we can do, that you'll have an active presence here at Fort Ticonderoga, and you actually have Mohawk people on site in order to explain our influence on this specific space and what it has meant to us in our history. So if you have any questions, I guess we have 10 minutes, we can go through it. Go ahead.
How are you acquiring the lands around Saranac Lake that you're talking about for this, with what funds?
Well, the New York State obtained a Camp Gabriel's from Paul Smith's College about 30 years ago. And they turned it into, initially it was supposed to be housing for the Olympic Village, and then it became a prison, minimum security work camp. 2 years ago they closed it, and they're looking for somebody to take it over. So we have met with the state in an effort to have that land returned to us, and it would then become a cultural center, a place of teaching, a summer camp for our kids, a language retention center, because here's the hard truth. There are 100,000 Iroquois people that we know of. There are 80,000 that we know are enrolled. The vast majority of them do not live on Indian communities. They live off reservation. And what that has meant is a cultural disruption and a disruption in language. Of the 35,000 Mohawks now, less than 5,000 have a working knowledge of their own language. Amongst the Senecas, over 20,000, 25,000 Senecas, the number of speakers is less than 500. You can't retain a culture without having access to that language. And so our conclusion was that we need to have a center where it actually can be learned. And we need to have an academic program where kids can actually get a degree in Iroquois language. So for the first time in North America, other than Hawaii, Syracuse University, in conjunction with our institute, will offer a degree program in an Aboriginal language. Pretty good stuff. Yeah. So that's where we're going now. We'll be meeting with various state officials and try to get that camp turned over to us as soon as possible.
Do you know how long that's going to take? Do you have any idea?
Well, I think with right now we're concentrating on securing that land at Cohoes, and we hope to have a viable visitor center there in Waterford, and then that'll be the next phase. It'll be go after Camp Gabriel. So I think we can do it very quickly. I met with the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne in April, and they're willing to commit to financially supporting it. But their question to me after I described the buildings, and the buildings are in pretty good shape, we had various visitors there, and they said, well, this sounds too good to be true. And because, we've been burned a lot. And I said, no, it isn't. Go there see for yourself. They went, and they saw that the buildings There's some cosmetic repairs that have to be made, but basically it's ready to be moved in, and it was designed as a college campus. So we're going to push on that very quickly. And if you have access to Senator Betty Little, she's been very encouraging for us, then I would call her and say, let's get this done. It would not only be a good economic boost to the northern part of the Adirondacks, I think it would do a lot towards improving our relations with our neighbors. And remember this, that we are not casino Mohawks. We shouldn't be qualified for that. That's only a very small fraction of our people that actually endorse that activity. That's not what we're about. But that's becoming the popular perception, but that's not, that we are, at least the people I work with, are adamant about retaining the essence of our heritage, and that doesn't come in a casino, that comes with interaction with the natural world. So that's one of our goals. Go ahead.
You're probably aware of this, but 300 acres around Ray Fadden's
Yes.
museum is now on the market. Would
Yes.
there be any chance of being able to combine this with this Camp Gabriel's thing?
I'll talk to John about that, John Fadden, and see how we can do that. Because we just got our nonprofit status, which is essential before the state can actually seriously consider turning it over to us. So we just got that. So I'll talk to John about that. Because Ray Fadden's museum is now 54 years old, going into its 55th year, and it needs a new building. And at Camp Gabriel's, the facilities are there to actually have a Six Nations Museum outreach. And it's right on the most heavily traveled road between Montreal and Lake Placid. So it's ideal for what our plans are. So some great news there. And then we'll make a big splash when the date for the signing over actually happens. So any other questions? I left a lot out there, but a whole wide of areas for you to consider. Big net. Oh, go ahead.
I was wondering if there's, in this institute at Syracuse, if there's much about the law, the legal traditions and
yes.
historic stuff.
Yes. Good question. Excellent. See, well, I was at a conference in Palm Springs, California. Actually, I attended this conference twice. It's called Native Justice. It was an attempt by Native peoples from throughout America to find an alternative to the adversarial American-based judicial system and try to find one that's based on Native teachings that actually work. And they were desperate. How do we find something that works for us? Because we can't continually put our people in prisons or brand them as criminals when most of the things they're accused of doing is not a result of criminal behavior, it means deviant minds, it's a result of behavior and diet and various other factors, cultural displacement. So we came up with the idea that the Great Law of Peace, which forms the basis for the Iroquois Confederacy and has worked for us, could actually become a working set of rules that's applicable on a communal level. Now, how can you do that? Well, what we propose as part of our Ainwatha Institute is to offer the first formal classes in any American law school through Syracuse that you can actually learn how Native traditional law works. How does it involve personal disputes, domestic problems, land use issues, traffic violations? Can the Great Law be applied in that way? And yes, it can. So one of our lawyers, who's well trained in this, is proposing to do just that. So I sent a note to the dean of the SU Law School to say that we are prepared to offer that as part of SU's normal curriculum. Now, the key is not to become part of an academic ghetto, because virtually every Native Studies department does fall into that trap. The part is, how do we make Native teachings relevant to your typical student? So a student at the end of 4 years at Syracuse or Paul Smith's or wherever can actually say that, yes, I understand. And that's where we want to break out of that mold. So we want to offer formal instruction on Native telecommunications, and there is a viable field for that in SU School Newhouse. Native American economics in this SU School of Management and Business, that kind of stuff. Native American theater, Native American music within the standard curriculum of SU. And by the time the student leaves at SU, they'll at least have exposure to this. That's what we're proposing to do. And no other school has tried this, so it'll be something truly unique. Go ahead.
Thank you, Doug. Actually,
She had one. Can we take one question? Go ahead.
Well, the Tupper Lake Visitor Center
Yes.
that's been taken over by Saranac
Yes.
be part of the same tradition.
Well, that leads us to one of the great Iroquois accomplishments, and that is the ability to form alliances. And it's a really great story because it tells you how a few thousand Iroquois people managed to oversee an area larger than Western Europe at the time. And that was not because we were the greatest fighters, and we were. Not because we were the greatest diplomats, and we were. Not because we controlled the economic livelihood of Native peoples in the Midwest, which we did, but it happened because we were skilled at creating natural alliances. You know, when they saw us, you didn't just see members of the Mohawk Nation. You saw other Iroquois people and other Native peoples, Shawnees, Miamis, Kickapoos, Lenapes. That's what our strength was, creating natural alliances, working together towards a common goal. So as we move along, that's what we're trying to do, to be guided by that. So not to work against cross purposes against the state or any other agency, but to try to find common ground. And we do have a common ground with anybody who advocates for the preservation of life and community Adirondacks, because we have the same absolute commitment. So that's what we're going to try to do. Work with whomever under whatever conditions present itself to the betterment of this land and for our children's children. That's our goal. So with that, I appreciate it. But remember, www.hiawatha, HIAWATHA, the way it's .syr.edu. So we got a great thing coming, and I'm optimistic that it'll be for the benefit of everybody who cares about the Adirondacks. So thank you for opening your ears and your mind. Thank you very much. Now go on.